Truth doesn't shout, waits until you're ready to listen. Before I say anything else, I want to begin properly. I acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the First Nations custodians of this land. Across all countries, nations, languages, and songlines, I honour elders past and present. And I want to be very clear when I say this. This is not a script to me. It is not a box to tick. It is not something I say out of obligation. This land holds memory, it holds grief, it holds endurance, it holds stories that were never written down, but were never lost. Every conversation we have about loss, survival, intuition, trauma, resilience, family, and healing exists because this land has carried those realities for tens of thousands of years. Long before podcasts, long before psychology, long before spiritual language was commodified and sold back to people looking for relief. I acknowledge that truth with respect. And I also want to acknowledge you, each and every one of you listening. Wherever you are, on whatever land you're on, at whatever point in your life you find yourself right now, I want to say thank you. Not casually, not reflexively, genuinely. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for giving me a chance. And I say chance deliberately because that's exactly what this is. This is a chance to speak honestly without implying. This is a chance to listen without fixing. This is a chance to sit with things that don't have neat endings or operational conclusions. This is a chance to tell the truth without softening it so it's easier to consume. You don't owe me your time. You don't owe me your agreement. You are choosing to be here, and I don't take that lightly. This is shaped clean. I want to start the first episode by telling you why this podcast exists at all, because I don't believe in talking into the void without accountability. I'm not here because I healed perfectly. I'm here because I didn't. And somewhere along the way, I realized something most people are too afraid to say out loud. A lot of what we call healing is just learning how to function while avoiding the truth about what still hurts. We get very good at coping, at managing, at presenting a version of ourselves that appears stable, grounded, evolved. And then one day, often quietly, we realize survival has slowly become our entire personality. This podcast exists because I hit that realization head on. Not once, but more than once. And I've lived a life where responsibility arrived early, where awareness came before safety, where intuition showed up long before I had language, support, or adults who could recognize what was happening inside me. And I would like to say this because people romanticize it constantly. Cold is not a gift. It is a response to not having a choice. And that's not resentment. That's fact. And when you grow up having to read rooms, manage moods, anticipate danger, or emotionally carry people who should have been carrying you, your nervous system adapts and it sharpens. It stays alert. It learns how to survive. And later in life, people call that empathy, intuition, emotional intelligence, without acknowledging what it cost you to develop it. The body remembers what the mind learned to minimize. And I have spent years trying to understand myself through every lens available. Psychological, emotional, spiritual, intuitive, and not because it's trendy, not because I wanted an identity, because I was trying to survive my own inner world without destroying myself or anyone else in the process. And one of the first truths that I learned was self-awareness does not automatically bring peace. Sometimes it brings you grief, sometimes it brings anger, sometimes it brings a loneliness so quiet it's hard to explain. Because once you see clearly, you can no longer participate in denial, not yours and not other people's. And that is when things begin to fall apart. Friendships, beliefs, identities that you have built just to survive. And people talk about awakening like it's all light and relief. What they don't talk about is the middle ground, free fall, place where old stories no longer work, but the new ones haven't formed yet, where you see the patterns clearly but don't yet know how to change them without blowing your life apart. I've lived there. I've lived with grief that doesn't fit into neat boxes. Grief for people I love. Grief for versions of myself that never got to exist. Grief for childhoods that should have been safer. Grief for decisions made under pressure or survival rather than choice. And let me say this plainly because someone listening needs to hear it without apology. Grief does not disappear just because time passes. It changes shape, goes quiet, it resurfaces, it lives in the body. And neuroscience backs this up. Memory and attachment are stored somatically. Smells, dates, tone of voice, silence, even moments of happiness can reactivate grief decades later. That doesn't mean you're weak. It means you loved deeply. We live in a culture that is profoundly uncomfortable with that truth. So we rush people and we tell them to move on, to be grateful, to reframe, to forgive before they've even been allowed to feel angry. And sometimes meaning comes, but sometimes it doesn't arrive on schedule. And forcing it only delays the real work. And another truth that I've learned, and this one really hurt, come to truth with, and that's being the emotionally capable one often means becoming the emotional person for everyone else. You become the listener, the fixer, the steady presence. Eventually, you don't know how to ask for help without feeling like a burden yourself. That pattern didn't come from nowhere. It came from learning early that your value was tied to what you carry. And I've tried to break that pattern, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. There were times I stayed too long in relationships, romantic, family, spiritual, because I confused loyalty with self-abandonment. And I told myself I was being compassionate, patient, understanding. And sometimes I was. Sometimes I was just afraid of what would happen if I stopped holding everything together. So let me say this clearly. Endurance is not the same as virtue, and staying is not always noble. Sometimes it's a trauma response dressed up as strength. I've been deeply spiritual, and I've also been deeply disillusioned, and I've seen how spiritual language can heal and how it can silence, how words like forgiveness, surrender, and love can be used to bypass accountability, boundaries, or uncomfortable truths. That is not spirituality. That is avoidance, just with better branding. Mediumship sits here too, and I want to speak about it honestly. Mediumship is not a badge of superiority. It is not proof of enlightenment. It is not a shortcut to healing. It requires grounding, regulation, psychological awareness, and humility. And without those things, it becomes projection or an unconscious attempt to make sense of unresolved pain. And I've questioned myself relentlessly, and I have doubted my own perceptions. I've sat in the silence wondering whether what I felt was intuition or survival instinct dressed up as insight. And that questioning matters because certainty without self-reflection is dangerous, especially in spiritual spaces, especially today. And another truth people don't like hearing is that sensitivity without boundaries becomes self-destruction. Being open doesn't mean being available to everyone. Being empathic doesn't mean absorbing what isn't yours. And being intuitive doesn't mean ignoring your mental and emotional health. I learned this through burnout, through withdrawal, through periods of depression where I didn't recognize myself, through moments of shame where I wondered how someone so aware could still feel so lost. And the answer was very confronting, but very simple. That awareness doesn't erase trauma, it illuminates it. And I've faced the financial stress, relationship breakdowns, isolation, the quiet humiliation of having to pause things I cared deeply about because life demanded survival before growth. And I've learned that love alone does not fix addiction, avoidance, or patterns someone refuses to face. And that realization nearly broke me because when you love deeply, you want to believe effort will be enough. And sometimes it isn't. And that doesn't mean you failed. It means you reached the limit of what was yours to carry. I'm not sitting here telling you I fixed everything because I haven't. Some wounds are quieter now. Some are still really tender. Some of them I understand, but I've not really integrated them. And healing is not a finish line. It's a relationship you maintain with yourself. And there are days that I'm grounded and clear, and there are days old patterns whisper up again. And there are days I respond instead of react. And there are days I catch myself doing exactly what I said I wouldn't do anymore. And that's not failure. That's being human. And there is a quote that I come back to often, and it's insight does not absolve you of pain. It gives you responsibility for how you meet it. This podcast isn't about answers. It's about honesty and naming what hurts without dramatizing it or minimizing it. About acknowledging that many people in spiritual and personal growth spaces are deeply traumatized and doing their best with limited tools, language, and support. And if you're listening and you've ever felt like you didn't fit into your family, into spirituality, into the version of healing everyone else seems to achieve effortlessly, now I see you. And if you've ever wondered why you're exhausted, even when you're doing everything right, it might be because your nervous system has never truly felt safe. And safety is not a mindset, it is an experience. If you've ever felt ashamed that you still struggle after all that insight you've gained, knowledge without compassion becomes another weapon against yourself. And compassion doesn't mean letting everything slide. It means telling the truth without cruelty. And that's what I'm doing here. This space will hold stories, mine, and reflections of what I've witnessed in others, clarity and uncertainty, psychology and lived truth. I won't promise comfort every episode, but I will promise you honesty. And I want to end this first episode by opening the door a little wider, not by closing. This podcast is not meant to be a one voice talking at people. This is an invitation that if you've ever felt called to come onto a podcast and say it plain, to a truth without being sanitized, spiritualized, or talked over, you are welcome here. And you don't need to be healed. You don't need to be polished. You don't need answers. You just need to be honest. Because some of the most important conversations don't come from experts. They come from people who have lived through something and are finally ready to name it. So thank you for trusting me with your time, for listening without needing this to be comfortable. Thank you for staying. Wherever you are, take care of yourself gently, but truthfully. This is Say It Plain, and we'll keep talking.